This is Misty here to talk about Grant Writing 101.
Yeah, Grants 101
Grants.
and from pre-award to post-award.
Okay, take it away.
Would it be okay if we kind of ran around, because there are a couple of you I don't know, real quickly.
Sharday Mills, librarian. I help put on the brown bags. Hello, everybody.
Hi, I'm Marianne Selena. I'm the student navigator in addiction studies.
Debbie Ortiz, grant manager with Addiction Studies.
Unity Goodman, interim dean.
Mark Levengood, history.
Nice to meet you, Mark. Say again your name?
Marianne.
Marianne.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and I've seen that name
Yes.
on email. It's nice to be able to.
It's nice to meet you face to
Travis.
face.
Travis, yep.
From Cincinnati. So just really quickly, I've worked with a few of you, and so I feel like in some ways I'm sharing information you probably already know some of, but it's a great opportunity for me to kind of go over what my office does. So a couple of years ago, I have been at the college for 7 years actually, at the district for 5, and a couple of years ago, the administration recognized that we had a lot of folks doing a lot of really great stuff, both within their organizations, with students, and within grant programs. And so we needed to be a little more formalized and provide some support for folks working on grant proposals. If you're familiar with the university format, a lot of times both pre-award, which is that time that you're looking at grant funding, you're deciding to submit a proposal, you're submitting it, that part, and then once you get awarded is all within one department. Makes it a little confusing for us because that's split between district business office and my office. And so this is a great opportunity for me to kind of talk about what my office does, but I will often refer to the district business office as we go through some of the post-award stuff. So just a quick agenda. Here are a few things that we're going to talk about. I'd like to make it as informal as possible, so just interrupt me with a question if you have a question about some of the things that we're talking about. And then I'm hoping at the very end, I'm going to go through this a little quickly, so do stop me if I go too fast. Because I'd like to have a little bit of a conversation about what your thoughts are in terms of future grant funding or some work that you're currently doing that you think, hey, this might be a great grant proposal, and I can give you some feedback and hopefully connect you to some resources. So one of the first things I wanted to do today is just go over some resources. As I developed my office, some resources have changed. And so I wanted to point to you a couple of things. We have an external website now for my office, and it's right under that About CCS. There's a link for grants and sponsored research. My understanding is even with the new changes to the website that mine will still be either under About, possibly under Community if you've seen some of the mock-ups for the new websites, but we will still have this external facing site. And the idea with this external facing site is that we can promote some of the awesome work that's being done under the auspices of what we call sponsored research, basically research projects or research activities that we're doing at the college that is in some way sponsored by funding of some kind. There's also a link there for faculty and staff, and one of the things I discovered really quickly is all of my really great resources that are under CCSnet, under that tab that says Grants and Sponsored Research, nobody was going to, because for the most part, faculty and staff, if they're not at the district, don't really use the internal district site. So we added this link for faculty and staff so that if you ever are thinking, gosh, where was that on the intranet? You can go to our external facing page, hit for faculty and staff, and it will take you to the login for CCSnet, which is the intranet for the district. And then my tab is under Grants and Sponsored Research. And so I'll show you just really quickly what some of those resources look like. So under Grants and Sponsored Research, here's a little life cycle for grants to give you an idea, and I actually have a slide about that as well, but I'll explain it here really quickly. When we talk about, you know what, I'm gonna wait till we get to the slide because it's bigger and you can see it. Under Grants and Sponsored Research, the workshop that we're going to talk about here in a minute is right there. Finding grant opportunities, some data tools that you can use, research resources for any kind of research on, say, best practices if you're thinking about something related to student services or instructional areas. And then under pre-award proposal development, and I'll show you that real quick, There's a lot of great tools that we've put out there to try to help you as you're looking at a proposal, and it's talking about, for instance, an evaluation plan. You'll see that under support document, or a logic model, and you'll see that under proposal development tools. There's some examples there for you so that you know what those look like. Budget development. There's also even a grant writing training on lynda.com for those of you who have lynda.com accounts. So there's some great resources there. Under post-award compliance, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more towards the end of my presentation. It's an area where my office has expanded our role more recently just because we've seen a need to support more folks that are engaging in grant work. But there are some of the post-award checklist, which also, by the way, there's a pre-award checklist or a proposal development checklist on the other side as well. Time and effort tracking, information about our administrative policies on records management for grant activities. So a lot of that information is going to be right there. And then just recently, we have had some changes in federal grant funding. So we are requesting that folks fill out conflict of interest forms that are beyond the state ethics requirement. And I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to the post-award piece. But all of those forms are under this site too. So that's just a quick, there's where you find everything as you're working on information. And that's fairly new. Within the last year, we've tried to really develop that out. So just quick goals and objectives. Because my office is fairly new, it's only about 2 years old, we spend a lot of time really trying to figure out what's our purpose and what's our role. So grants and sponsored research culture is really about how we develop the culture within CCS, and we do work with both campuses. And so that can be anything from finding funding opportunities for you. So you email me and you say, I have this great idea, or I'm doing this great work, I need to scale this. We have pilot, it's shown to be really successful. We think this would be great to scale across our campuses or scale across our division. Can you help me find some funding opportunities for that? A lot of what I hear sometimes is travel, and depending upon the travel, if it's part of a larger project, there's normally funding available for travel. If it's just I want to go to a conference because I think it would be important, that's a little bit harder sell from a grant perspective. But I try to work with the CCS Foundation to look for other funding opportunities that might be available for you for those sorts of things. Equipment is another one. When you think about grant funding, you think of that from often a project-based perspective. So what is it that I'm doing, or what work would I like to do that's part of a bigger project? That makes sense to think about in terms of grant funding. If it's I need a piece of equipment, or I'm doing something, I just need money to send students on the trip to experience this with me, that's not normally a good grant project, because funders like big picture things, right? They like to fund things that they think are scalable. They like to fund things that they think are going to make a big difference institutionally, or that are going to make big differences for groups of students. Proposal development, submission, post-award compliance. These are all part of developing that proposal, what we call the pre-award area, and then sponsoring professional development. So doing things like this, brown bags, doing things like the workshop that I've got coming up, and I've got a flyer here for you. And when we get to the presentation, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's one of the efforts that we're doing to try to engage more faculty and staff. And then our second big goal is engaging in regional, statewide, and international partnerships, employing best practices. So promoting research success and innovations that engage community and establish partnerships. So we're doing a lot of different grant projects with different folks in the community, and that sort of falls under that area. So many times, if you're thinking about, for instance, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, they're very interested in community coalition building. So we see grants quite often that will say, you know, what is your community? How does your community address this? And that's where promoting research and community partnerships are really important, because many times we're not necessarily the ones applying for the grant, but we want to be at the table. If the city of Spokane or the county is applying for something as a community designation, we have the students most often that can really benefit from those types of programs, depending upon what area it is. Many times we have the more diverse student population, which funders are always looking for. So we want to be part of that conversation. So I help facilitate that. With guidance from our faculty and staff, because you guys are the ones out there doing the work. I mean, you're the ones working with community organizations a lot of times, or you're working on service projects. And so when you have the opportunity to be part of something, call me and we can talk about how we can be at the table maybe. And then one of the things that I personally have been working a lot on is policies and procedures that align. You know, we're not an R1 institution. We are starting at the bottom and we're working and expanding what the footprint looks like for grants and sponsored research. And so many times trying to put policies and processes and procedures in place is where I spend a lot of my time, but maybe isn't as visible. So this is that grant life cycle, and I only share this and I put it on the internal because I think it helps people. If you've never worked on a grant, it kind of gives you the perspective of what the entire life cycle looks like. So my office tends to fall in these three quadrants here: finding funding, developing the proposal, submitting the proposal. But more and more I find myself over here along with the district business office in this managing grant projects. Because what happens if we don't do well on this? We're not going to have an option of doing these things. And so we're kind of realizing that this is much more important than I think. We sort of had this disaggregated focus that will support you in getting it funded, and then the college and the deans and the departments still have huge roles and responsibilities, and they are where the buck stops, but they need support. They need to be able to ask people questions and know where to go and find out is it okay to reach out to a program officer and ask them that question, or am I jeopardizing my funding if I ask them something like that? So we can often help with that. And then close out of the project, that's really the district business office. That has to do with how you spend your money. Are you spending it out in a responsible way? Reimbursement, all of those things. So, just really quickly, I want to show you a couple of things that our office does quite often. So scoping documents, for those of you who've worked with me, a lot of times you'll send me a link and say, hey, I just saw this in my organizational, your professional organization newsletter just talked about these grants that are available. Is this something that we could apply for? And we put together what's called a scoping doc, because it is a little bit intimidating when you go out to grants.gov and you pull up a National Science Foundation grant. It's often that RFP, they call it request for proposals, is often pages and pages and pages. And a lot of times there's a lot of legal language at the end. So we can put this in 2, maybe 3-page document that says, here's when it's due, here's what they're looking for, here's some activities that you can do, and here's the activities they tell you can't do, here's how much you can ask for, and here's how long the grant's going to last. And then I added a section, I don't think anybody looks at it but me, but it makes me feel better. How does this align with our strategic plan? Because it's really important that we don't just, and this is just my little soapbox and I'll say that, it's really important that we don't just go after funding. I've said this at multiple levels of the organization, but I keep saying it because I think it's something we've got to be thinking about as an organization. Grant funding's not free money. There's a lot of coordination and work that goes with it. So you only, and Elodie's shaking her head because she knows, and Debbie knows, and Marianne knows, it's a lot of work. You have to have personnel to do this. So there's some issues that go along with this. Can we be sustainable? If we're going to apply for a grant and we're going to hire people to do this job, can we sustain the work of that grant? So that's a huge issue. Where does it fit within our strategic plan? If it's important enough and it's part of our strategic plan, we should be looking for ways to sustain that work. So it's not a one-off. Proposal status log, that's a log that I keep in my office just to kind of help us to understand what proposals are out there, what we've got going. Compliance pieces, we have several compliance areas that have to be checked box that we've done. I keep audit records, things like that in my office. And then identification of sponsored research is really that funding opportunities piece that we can do, is you can give us an idea and we'll go out there. And when I say we will, I will also mention that Bill Gillis works in my office as well, and he is really great to just come meet with you. We've had stakeholder groups of faculty that we've come and met with and worked on projects, and so we're always willing to do that as well if you have a group that's wanting to work on a grant project. So the other little I don't know what those are, little cubes or polygons that are in this slide are more the process, and these things around the side are more the things that we can sort of add value to as you're working through that process. So I wanted to quickly, because I think this is the interesting part, is talk a little bit about some grants for community colleges that we have experience with. Because it's always nice when you're looking at something for me to be able to say, hey, we've applied for this before. We know, we've got a template of a grant proposal. Or I have a peer on the other side of the state that's received this funding and they probably, or maybe would let us look at the grant proposal to see what they were proposing. And so the National Science Foundation, these are all NSF grants, awards about 64% of their community college funding goes to the ATE program, which is the Advanced Technological Education Program. We have received 2 of those awards here at SFCC. You may be familiar with them. Asa Bradley, Michelle Moore, Max Jospin had one working with Girls in STEM, and Scott Rollins and Adriana Bishop also received one for sustainability. It's very technical education focused, but one thing you'll notice about both of those grants, they were not in the tech ed area. They worked with technical education programs or instructors in the case of Scott's, but they were not in the advanced technological education area. So that is pretty broad, and as you can see, it's a lot of funding that goes to that program. STEM, we also just received. And I always like to share with people that that was the 3rd submission we made to STEM, because one of the things that people get disappointed in is you put a lot of time and effort into getting it together, and then if you don't get funded, it's like, okay, well, we tried, we're done. Really, that should be where the process starts. You usually get a lot of reviewer comments that help you to readjust and submit again. And so our 3rd submission, we just got that round of funding. 60%, so 24% of the NSF community college funding goes to STEM. It also is awarded to universities as well, but about 24% of their community college money goes to that particular program. Within that program, 60% of that funding has to be used for scholarships. So I like to point that out because a lot of people think, gosh, grants are so much work and they don't bring in students. That's a perfect example of a grant that brings in lots of students. That's the whole purpose of that grant, is to focus on student recruitment, retention for STEM students, and then supporting them once they get here. So that was for a pre-engineering grant that Jim Brady, Mark Gorski, Serena Robinson, and Greg Kripe are working on now. I have a meeting right after this with them. IUSE, 10% of the community college funding goes to that. That stands for Improving Undergraduate Student Education. So that's a great grant if you're thinking about student research, how you improve your education practice, so scholarship of teaching and learning that we do here. We may not be doing lab science, but we do, and I say we may not be because we do have faculty that do lab work with students or student research in the lab. But this is one of those grants that's really more looking at the scholarship of teaching and learning and that kind of research. And by the way, all of this is research according to NSF. And so when we think about these, there are a lot of, there are other areas that come to mind, such as Institutional Review Board. Is everybody familiar with your IRB here? Okay. So those are sort of the compliance pieces that we help you out with when you're applying for those. Make sure that you're filling out the right forms and getting the right information. Other grant programs, foundations. So the workshop that we're having next week is really focused on our local funders, and many times those are your foundations. Doesn't have to be. It can be corporate foundations. So we've received money from JP Morgan Chase. We've received money from Bank of America for a variety of different things. So foundations and local funders, College Spark Washington, we tend to think your Guided Pathways grant that you just got, that was College Spark Washington. We usually apply for them every year to their community grant program. They also have these other funding programs right now, including Guided Pathways, and so they've been a real front runner in that. Federal grants, SCC has received the Title III grant. I believe SFCC received that quite a few years ago. We've applied again, did not get funded this last round. TRIO, we've applied multiple times for TRIO. Those are all under the Department of Ed. But you also have NIH, you have NEH, Elodie and a group of faculty applied for a National Endowment for the Humanities grant that was not funded, but hopefully will be another iteration at some point. And then probably the vast majority of our funding comes from state workforce grants. So think about those grants from the state board or allocations like the HEAT grant. That's an allocation from the state board. So the state board basically is like a pass-through agency for funding that's coming from either the governor's office or the state of Washington. So just to give you an example of some of the grant fundings. I just wanted to briefly, just talk about the Mentor Links program. Every 2 years, a cohort is selected. This is a partnership between the American Association of Community Colleges and the National Science Foundation. And the RFP was released, I forgot to change that date, I apologize. The next cohort will be selected in 2019. So that will probably be right around February 2019 that RFP will be released. It's not really a lot of money. It's mainly travel to attend the NSF ATE conference if you are selected. And what's interesting about this is it's basically ATE's attempt to say, are there some faculty members out there, along with an administrator, which is kind of unusual, who really want to get something accomplished in a STEM field that's innovative, change to their program, take a look at how we're doing things and just really do some big changes. We want to match you with a mentor who maybe has already done that kind of work at another community college across the country. And so it's really a 2-year cohort. You don't have to submit a grant at the end, but the idea is that NSF would like for you to submit a grant to support the work. But the 2 years and the travel is really so you can learn more about the ATE program and that you have funding to maybe go visit your mentor a couple of times to really talk about your ideas and flesh out what that needs to look like. So it's a pretty easy application to apply for the Mentor Links program. It's very competitive. But I always like to show that because it's one of those things that happens unless funding is not available. About every 2 years, they select a 2-year cohort for that program. So be thinking about that. We had one cohort that applied this last round at SCC, but we didn't have any at SF. So, yes.
We see a lot of talk about STEM and opportunities for STEM faculty. What about CTE faculty who teach in the allied health, like addiction studies? Is there anything that my division faculty and staff could apply for?
So I don't know specifically. I will tell you NSF is not big on healthcare related programs. Now, biotech, yes. Healthcare in general, no. So my fear would be addiction and some of those areas, they would look at that more as a humanities or healthcare area. Probably would not be as competitive. What I see a lot in this are the technical programs, but like GIS technology and some of those things, the proposal we submitted from SCC was actually in the environmental sciences area, looking at GIS technology and what that might look like to embed that in more, not just in their programs, but across the campus, because GIS technology could be embedded in nursing classes,
So
looking at health
interdisciplinary.
indicators could be. So the idea was really exciting, I thought. It didn't get funded, but I thought it was a great idea.
So in other words, are there any other type of program, mentoring links program for non-STEM people at this time?
Not that I'm aware of. I will tell you that the humanities grant, and you're familiar with this, so, but other folks might not be, so I will share. That process that you went through where you were able to actually submit like a 2-pager and get feedback, that's fairly unique to the NEH. And so I always tell folks with NEH, a lot of their funding goes to universities and big departments of humanities and things like that. But because they have that one program for community colleges and they give you the option of sending something to them, there's not a lot of work up front. I mean, there's a lot of work in the sense that we're talking and we're collaborating and we're brainstorming what this might look like, but the writing is pretty minimal to actually send that in and get feedback. Now, if they give you a lot of good feedback and then you write it and you still don't get funded, it's been somewhat of a waste, but the idea is good, that they're giving you that opportunity. So those kinds of things are out there, but I've only ever seen them really with the NEH.
So humanities-based, not social sciences or CT.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, NSF directorates certainly cover, biology, trying to think what some, computer science is one of the biggest areas of NSF. The NIH is what really does a lot more in terms of medical healthcare. And NEH, that National Endowment for the Humanities, is where you see most of the support for humanities, English, social sciences. So, and then also don't forget our local, so Humanities Washington. We've we've seen a big cutback on funding to NEH. And so, for instance, the proposal that Elodie and her group applied for, we were expecting a new round, approximately the same time the next year. That's usually what happens. It was 18 months later before they released it because the changes to administration and things like that were happening. Well, Humanities Washington has suffered from the same thing. They do have some small seed grants that you can apply for. Not a lot, like there's like a $7,000 grant, and I wanna say there's like a $2,000 grant. I can ask Bill to send you more information on that. But a lot of times that's where you can really look for local funding to do initiatives that you might wanna do in the humanities area. So this is what usually happens when we get awarded, because a lot of times it's 9 months to a year, 6 months more to a year, before you find out you've been funded after you submit it. So this is why it's important to ask for help when you feel overwhelmed on both ends. So the proposal development piece as well as the post-award piece. So again, this is just a quick little graph to show you some of the things that we look at when we're helping you with developing a proposal. The sponsor requirements and certifications, how you develop that statement of need, the data that you might need to do that, that's a big one. Everything's really data driven now, so we encourage folks to work closely with IR. Objective work plan, and that's where that logic model comes in. We do a fair amount of brainstorming at the get-go and try to get everybody in the room. But then you have to put something on paper, right? I mean, we have all these great ideas, what does that look like? And that's where that work plan comes in. The logic model can help with that. Budget development is its own thing. We work specifically with you on that, but and I also work closely with the district business office, because many times that's where we'll get information on salaries, benefits, and all that. And then the data needs and the evaluation plan. Just a word about that. Some grants require you to have an outside evaluator to come in on a proposal, and we're always there to try to help connect you with people who can do that. The only problem is sometimes that's part of your funding that goes for that. So if they don't require it, we say, find somebody in HR or IR who can help you with that. But sometimes they require that, so that's one of the things we look for. Submission assistance. We do have an internal intent to apply for external funding form. And let me show you that really quickly. Those of you who've already been out there and looked at it, you know what I'm talking about, or have completed it. But under that pre-award, there's a link there that says intent to apply for external funding. And there's an electronic form there that you fill out. And there's a workflow that goes with it. So depending on what campus you tell me you're from, what department you're in, then it sends it to all the right folks that need to sign off on any external funding. And so sometimes that gets missed in our administrative processes, but that is part of our administrative process. So not to say you have to always engage our office, because you don't, but you do have to use that form to make sure that your dean and department chair and everybody's on board, that you're applying for funding. And students have to have a faculty sponsor to use that, to apply for funding. So just give you that. Okay. Just really quickly on post-award management, and really that picture of the baby, that's kind of more what I see when people first get their awards. But these are some of the things that we can help with, that award acceptance negotiation, and there are times when you want to negotiate because for whatever reason, they have approved the funding but not the funding you asked for, or not as much as you asked for. So that's when you can have that conversation with them about, look, I can't really do this work. Or we're okay with that, we have some supplemental funding that can help with that. Compliance review, the management of the budget, this normally occurs with a fiscal analyst. We have two at the district business office, Diana Benson and Doug Mitchell. They help with that. Program management is where I see often people contacting my office, which is perfectly fine. We're trying to do a better job to support people on the program management pieces, because there are a few things that, you know, Debbie, you can probably speak to this, but just things come up that you have questions about. Reporting, fiscal operation, and then close out. Spend down is huge. I usually have a post-award meeting right after it's awarded, and depending on the grant, we have multiple post-award meetings where we're talking about what that looks like, because you get yourself in a lot of trouble not spending money at the rate that you need to, because many grants will tell you you cannot spend money 30 days from the end of the grant period. So people forget that, and then they don't start off on a bang, they're kind of a little overwhelmed, and then, so we really encourage people to get going on that. So this is the workshop we have coming up next week. If you haven't registered, I would really encourage you to do so. I gave you a separate flyer that has the link at the bottom. This is something that my office is sponsoring, and it's basically a panel of representatives from these organizations that will talk to the specifics to their funding programs and what they fund. And then towards the end, we're gonna have some sort of one-on-one conversations at tables. And so if you've signed up for that, Bill Gillis will be reaching out to you to kind of say, are you coming just for informational? Do you have an idea that you think you would like to get more feedback on, because we can help make sure you're at the right table with the right funder if we think it's a specific type of ask. We're trying to keep it from being, hey, will you fund this for me? Because that puts our funders in kind of a difficult position, because many of these are competitive, so they can't tell you that you're gonna get funded, but they can certainly give you feedback on your project, like, that probably isn't the best fit, or if we were to fund that, here's some additional information we probably need you to provide for us. So would love to have your participation in that if you're interested at all. Again, these are folks that fund us or have funded us quite regularly. We're currently on a Hagen Foundation grant at SCC. And I'll real quickly tell you about that, because I think that's the most interesting part, is the projects that come out of this work. That was a partnership between the Environmental Sciences Department and the AP Environmental class at Central Valley School District. And they're working together out in the Saltese Flats area to document data and talk about what they're doing. Empire Health Foundation, we're currently on a grant with them. They're supporting the Act 2 program to do some senior healthy living things out in our rural areas. So, the other piece to the workshops next week, after that one is over at 3, we will have another workshop starting at 3:30. You can go to one, both, or neither. But this one's really on that post-award piece, and just going over some things. My co-presenters, Grace Leaf and Gloria Sapanova, are gonna talk a little bit about the fiscal compliance piece. And Debbie, when you come, make sure you mention if you have questions that you're working on allocation, because that really makes a difference in terms of the answers you're gonna get. And sometimes I forget to say, oh, this is an allocation, or this is a grant, federal grant, because those things are different. Quickly, just wanna mention that we have new training coming soon. So one of the new requirements with federal grants, I alluded to it earlier, is this conflict of interest piece. So if you're awarded a federal grant annually, you will receive from me a financial disclosure form, and it basically says, I don't have any conflicts of interest with this grant financially. There are other types of conflicts of interest. This is just to financial conflict of interest. I keep those on file. If I see a question about something, I can mitigate that. So we have a state ethics law that everybody falls under as a state employee, but why we had to go to the next level on this one is because federal grants say, you know, if you have a conflict of interest, and as a faculty, you very well might, if you have a business that's related to what your subject matter expertise is, it's not to say you can't get federal money. It just means we have to mitigate whatever that conflict of interest is. And that's why the state law didn't quite go far enough. The state law just says, don't participate if you have a conflict of interest. But in reality, there are ways to mitigate some of those things so that you're not overseeing the budget perhaps, or your research gets, you know, approved or falls within our own administrative policies in terms of the outcome of the grant. So that's why we're doing that now. That's an annual process. But there's also going to be some trainings as part of this collaborative institutional training on all kinds of conflicts of interest that I think will be interesting. It won't be required, but it will be information that's out there. For faculty, if you come from a university environment, you're probably very familiar with CITI. University of Washington uses it, WSU, Central, Western, they all use the same system. It's a national collaborative. There's also certification that comes with it, which is also one of the reasons we thought this would be the way to go, rather than us trying to develop all of these compliance trainings. Because once you go through this process, you will have something to show for that. And in fact, we may have faculty coming out of grad school that already have these certifications, which would be awesome. Same with human subjects research. We have not launched yet our human subjects, our IRB, Institutional Research Board, is reviewing some of these modules as well to try to figure out what we want to have available for folks. NSF does require any students, graduates, or postgraduates that are funded on NSF funding to go through what they call a responsible conduct of research training module. We have some flexibility about what that module has to look like, and so I'm going through those now to try to figure out, okay, is this really required? Because there's like 10 modules that go with that. So I'm trying to be as frugal and minimal as possible about what I think is really important. But this will be a new requirement if we have students being funded off of grant funding and they're actually doing some kind of research as part of the project, collecting data or doing any of that. Same thing with information security data management. NSF requires you to submit a data management plan. And so when we start working with NSF funding, I will probably request that faculty go through that information security data management module because it just protects you and helps you to understand what the requirements are. So anyway, most of this will be optional, but there will be a few things that will be required if you receive federal funding. And this is just another plug for the grants and sponsored research page. There's a really cool video out there right now called Girls Rock STEM. This came out of ASA's grant, ASA and Michelle and Josh Max's grant. So it's really kind of a fun look at these girls and their engagement in IT with that STEM grant. Any questions? Any projects you'd like to talk about?
Well, I'm not even sure if this question pertains to this specific brown bag, but on slide 7, you start mentioning sustainability after the grant's life is over.
Yes.
And I would love to hear more about that part of it, maybe not in this brown bag, but in future brown bags. For instance, we hired 2 fabulous people to oversee our grants for HEAT, which is really an allocation. But how do I find the funding to make it sustainable past the HEAT life?
It's a challenge, and it's something that really should be talked about although you weren't engaged in that, so I'm not saying that it was you at all. I'm just saying that's actually
I'm
part of
really-
the conversation that occurs at the beginning. And so a couple of strategies, I'll give you those. When we start looking at a grant, so most federal grant funds, you cannot supplant state funds. So basically you can't start paying somebody with the federal grant money and them still do the same work that they were doing all along. What you can do, however, is if you have justified that you need a part-time person, and many times that's where, people get very creative. So I don't really need a full-time person to coordinate this grant program, but I would need about half their time. There may be other allocations or grant-funded programs that could support part of that person's time and the grant would support the other. So that when you come to the end of that, if you're not planning on reapplying or you don't know if there's another funding source, you can at least look at only needing part of it as opposed to the full amount.
I thought I heard you said that part of the grant's life is to look at sustainability and not rely on just the grants once they're gone. So do you know of any grants that SFCC or even SCC have received and from which we have moved on and yet we're able to fund the same staffing to support the program without the grant?
No, other than we've moved people into other positions. So we've kept the positions, but not necessarily the program, depending on. So for instance, NSF grant funding, because most of that work is being done by faculty, usually receive release time to do that. So when the grant's over, as they're thinking about how to absorb this work, if there's a continuation piece to the work, that becomes more an allocation of time as opposed to a new person. Most of the time when we have, so for instance, the Title III grant, the Title III grant, most of those positions are absorbed as part of IR because there was a huge data element. So part of that sustainability was, how do we continue with supporting an IR department that's this size? Well, they looked at the the student performance measurements and said, you know what, this is making a huge difference. We now have increased FTEs. We will use that increased funding, not literally use that funding, but that's our argument for we need to keep these positions. Same with navigation. That's another one that's kind of comes up a lot with grants is we need a navigator, and it's clearly visible at the end of the grant that these positions are important. So oftentimes people look for other areas to combine that maybe need that navigation assistance. But I think it's a huge issue to discuss with administration and why we always try to get deans involved in the conversation, because you're the ones that have to try to figure that out a lot of times.
So I assume that you were part of the conversation when we applied for the HEAT grants. Do you have any notes on what the sustainability documentation was, if any?
So if I remember correctly, that position was split between the early achievers allocation, which is something we apply for every year, and as far as I know, there's no plans to discontinue that.
Actually, early achievers is dwindling, so we are, and we separated the two grant managers' duties because of addiction studies being its own huge program to manage.
Right.
So in other words, it doesn't sound like there were any discussion of moving forward past the HEAT life.
Well, there was, but it was early achievers. So if that's dwindling, because it's only increased the last years that I've been working on. So are you thinking this coming year that?
Yeah, it appears that they will phase it out. Yeah, Leanna Drake mentioned that it's been lived out.
Yeah, and depending upon the personnel, it's really, it puts them in a position of looking for another position at the end of a grant term as well, if some thought hasn't been given to what will happen at the end of that grant. And usually grants require you to write a paragraph on sustainability, and I encourage people to give some thought to that and not just say, oh, if it works, because this is what happens sometimes. Well, if it's successful, then of course we will be able to fund it because we've shown it to be successful, but that's not the reality a lot of times. And so I encourage people to give that a lot of really good thought when they write the sustainability piece of the grant, because most grantors know that as well. That's why they ask you that is, if we put all this money into this program and you're doing some great things, what's the university or the college's commitment to continue? So, and no thoughts about applying for a HEAT grant for next year?
We are, I'm just
Or
thinking-
allocation?
Yeah. We are thinking of going for HEAT 11. My main concern is we have two amazing people we have hired, and I would like to see the position transform in a way that it is not allocation based. And I
Sure.
was hoping to hear that maybe there is a way that previous grants have transformed grant-funded position into a permanent position at the institution. Because of the
I think the
need.
TACT grant here did they not? The director for the TACT grant, is that not in a permanent position now? Or
I don't even know what that is.
Yeah, I don't know.
so over in the orthotics and prosthetics program, is that not an example of?
With Ruthie Deering. Well, I had heard that, I think they're using, because they've had a lot of conferences that they put on, and I think they're using the funds from that, so they put on like 2 or 3.
So for continuing education.
Right, and there's also, besides that they had classes for like fitters and stuff. Yeah, so I think they're using those funds.
So that's an example of taking the grant work and continuing on with the grant work and using that work to then fund that position, if it makes sense to do so. Obviously it doesn't always make sense to do that depending upon the grant funding. So.
This isn't in my area, but do we know whether Kaiser Permanente has any money for healthcare stuff since they're new in town?
So we have a couple of things that we've done recently with Kaiser. They did fund an event that Gabby Ryan and Amy Powlick did here, a healthcare fair. It was a pretty small grant that they applied for, so they do have health funding available. It's a very simple application, so if you have a project, it's not a lot of money either, so that, you know, those two things tend to go together. Simpler, not as much money. Bigger money, sometimes more involved. But yeah, they did do that. They also are partnered with us on the heat allocation we were just talking about that SCC has. So we partner with a labor partner on that particular allocation, and our labor partner, SEIU, has represented groups at both Kaiser and Multicare entities. And so we've worked pretty closely with Kaiser to provide navigation for students going back to school at Kaiser. But they don't have, as far as I know, they don't have just, a grant program per se that you can apply for other than that sort of sponsorship health fair application.
Might be worth reaching out to them since they're new, they might wanna do more to improve their,
Are you volunteering for us?
no, it's not I'm not healthy.
So Elodie, the other thing I would encourage you with the sustainability is have a conversation with Jim Brady or Laura Zemp and see what other deans have kind of done to try to absorb or look for options for those positions.
I wonder if Perkins could be used as well. But that's another allocation.
Yeah, but the funding for Perkins really does support student success, and so if you have positions that are, and we have a good record with navigators and coaches. This isn't a new thing. With the Flex Tech program over in Laura's area, we had a completion coach, but kind of the same model. And I actually encourage people to think about that with most grants now that we apply for that are student engagement is, what would it look like to have this person, and then can you support that with an increase in FTE? Could you make that argument that this person is really responsible for retaining students, which gives us student success points, which means more money, and getting students in the program, which also brings in income.
Well, can they also be used thinking moving forward is not only recruitment, retention, but also completion? Is the completion piece part of that conversation?
In terms of sustainability,
In terms of student success?
oh yeah,
Because if Perkins is only to recruit and retain, but we don't care how they finished or not, and with CTE programs in human services, we are actually having a huge workload issue in advising, where one faculty can be advising 100+ students. So a lot of students will fall through the cracks, and it's just not manageable. But having a Perkins allocation funded curricular advisor / completion coach / navigator for our programs could be, I'm thinking out loud. So,
no, I think, and I'm not sure how the completion coach was funded that was here before. I don't believe it was grant funded. I think it was something with the institution.
yes, we funded
Supported.
it through our V budgets, our local revenue,
Okay.
but I'd like to make it more sustainable to have some on our V budget and then some on someone else's budget.
So, and then from a process perspective, if you're working on a grant program, then you're working with HR to develop the job description, so it's clear that it's a position that's only for I was actually hired on funding, so I guess I could have used my example. I was hired on a grant at SCC 7 years ago, and when that grant funding ended, I moved into an acting director for workforce position. So it wasn't exactly what I was doing before, but it was all under the same division. So, when those opportunities arise, it's not great for the grant because sometimes you lose people, but certainly you want to encourage good people to stay too. So that's something to be thinking about with your job descriptions and working with HR. Grace is going to talk a little bit about that because that's been something that's come up with developing job descriptions on grant programs, and I have a template that people can use for that, but you do have to be very clear that this is on what I would call soft money. I don't know if that's the terminology that they use, but basically that this is a temporary position as long as the funding is there.
I think we used that template.
So since all of these, since these grant proposals are coming through you and college, does that mean we have access to all of them to read them, the proposals?
Not all of them, but I'm always willing to ask somebody. I don't share unless somebody tells me they're okay with it. Matter of fact, I get requests all the time from the West Side State, from my peers saying, hey, I saw you guys got funded, can you share your proposal? And depending on what it is, you know, if we're, depending on what it is and depending on how much work has gone into it from somebody's perspective, right? So if there's research and things that have gone into it, but if it's, the heat allocation or something like that, that's pretty specific proposal that everybody fills out the same way. It's just different based on what you said you were going to do. And so they're really more looking at activities. So sometimes I will cut and paste activities and just say, okay, here's the things we proposed. Because a lot of that you can get from an abstract anyways. What they're looking at is, how many students did you include if it's not in the abstract? Because, sometimes your questions are, I don't want to overextend and say I'm going to produce the moon, but at the same time, I don't want to not get funded because they're looking at my funding per student ratio and I'm spending $20,000 per student. That's probably not going to get you funded. So what's that sweet spot, So sometimes you get questions like that. But I always reach out, Mark, and ask if it's okay if I share a proposal. Internally, we've done that also with, for instance, Welty. We've had a number of faculty that said, we're fine with sharing our proposal to folks that are wanting to apply for the Welty program. And you guys know about Welty with the foundation, right? That's not under my area, but I always try to promote that that's an internal grant program as well as the mini grants for faculty to apply for.
Do you know any local organizations or government or whatever that has funded undergrad research, not necessarily at our college, but in the region?
Mm-hmm. So I have a table if you're interested in that. I just put it together about 6 months ago. Bill put it together and then we tweaked it a little bit, but I've shared it out to multiple people, and it lists some federal funding sources that promote undergraduate research or that fund undergraduate research. And so, for instance, NSF has that IUSE program,
I was
which.
talking more about local though. Like
Local. I'm sorry, I
organizations,
misunderstood
is that
your
what
question.
is the money
Yeah, I haven't.
cost of that?
Yeah, I haven't seen that. Let me think. We've discussed Inland Northwest Community Foundation as a possibility because they do some really intensive community type funding. If we could show that this is a contribution to the community, so maybe a combination of service, learning, and undergraduate research like that Saltese project, I've often thought that they would be we've not had any success with them. So one of the reasons I invited them to come to the Funders Forum is because I'm going to do the same. I'm going to pick their brain and say, what is it you're really looking for? Because we've submitted a couple of different things, some suicide prevention stuff for faculty. We've done a few projects and have not been funded by Inland Northwest Community Foundation. So my sense is that it's not enough of a community impact. So when we do things internally, we see value in it for our faculty and our students, but maybe they're not seeing the community value. But I would think undergraduate research, especially if there's a service learning component to it, would be very, very attractive. So that's what comes to my mind.
Could you pull up the slide again with the city, training for
CITI?
research? Okay, so it's something that's coming soon. Right now in the library, we've had a couple grants where, very library specific, but one of the things we really struggle with is, well, not struggle with, it's a good thing. We have a librarian code of ethics of what type of information we'll collect on people. I know that's kind of more of an IR question, but at the same time, to be able to kind of gather the information we need, we're kind of in a spot where, I don't know, we can't really decide, is that worth collecting the information, even if we had IR scrub it, do we feel comfortable doing that? So is this something that you said that's coming soon? Is it something that anyone could?
So we're going through the modules now. We didn't
Okay.
want to just put it out there and say, hey, sign up for an accountant, because it's overwhelming, I will tell you. We just got the basic package, and you get all of these modules. And so Amy McCoy has just yesterday, we had a meeting with her IRB, and that we kind of divvied up some of these modules, but as soon as we can kind of go through them, and we indicate on there which ones we want, so one of the things you can do is say, this is required, and 3 electives from this area could give you a certification in IRB or whatever, if they think that's warranted. I'm not sure what the outcome of that will be. But as you can imagine, that kind of requires you not just to go through the models, but kind of think, okay, is this covered somewhere else? Is it something? So we're trying to go through all of those now and figure out what's gonna be optional, what are we gonna have out there, what's gonna be overwhelming that we're gonna tell people don't bother. Cause you wanna pull your hair out. So we're hoping to get this online within the next month or so. Yeah, I think she's got another meeting in April, but if you would like to look at the modules, we can certainly set you up an account if you want to
Oh,
just
thank
look
you.
at that particular area, sure. Just a word to that too with the research. So data is a big thing right now, especially with the feds. We have had to really beef up our data management plan and with records retention. So there are requirements that the federal government has and the state has on how long you need to keep grant records, both electronically and in a file. So at the end of the grant period, so part of the post-award meeting that I do is going over records retention. Then at the end of the grant period, I send out an email and say, just as a reminder, you have to keep these records because the retention period starts at the end of the grant. So if it's 6 years out, that's from the end of the grant, right? So the 2 NSF grants that we had here just ended this year. So I sent one of those emails. Well, that generated this huge conversation about how are we keeping this data, right? Because the data that they collected has to be de-identified for one thing. But it has to be accessible because one of the things that NSF, the 2 criteria for NSF is intellectual merit, whatever you propose, has to show that, and it also has to show a broader impact. Well, that broader impact section is how are we disseminating the information that we've done as part of this grant project? So that creates an issue because we have to have this information available if somebody comes to us and says, you need to tell us, what happened with this grant and so not identified data, but you have to be able to longitudinally show the results of your project. So we have to keep it somewhere that some people can have access, but not everybody. So IR is working on this, and we actually developed a shared file on Jim Brady's shared file drive that is password protected for him and the 3 PIs for each project. And that's kind of where we landed on how we would keep all those electronic documents. And they wouldn't live on the faculty's computers because we need to be able to access them for the entire length of the grant. So that's created a great discussion for us because we had not had NSF grants before. And so although state requires you to have records retention as well, state funding is not as strenuous, I will say, in terms of what the feds require for the dissemination piece. So we often say, at State Board Grant, we often say, hey, we're gonna share this information at the ATL conference, or we're gonna go to the Guided Pathways conference, and we're gonna tell them about what we did, but it's not having to provide our data to somebody to then go through and say, okay, is this the results of this project, what you said your results were, that level. And so that's where it generated some great conversation. So I would think your librarians would kind of be in that same boat. And one of the exemptions, and this is where it gets really tricky, is data you collect as part of your academic programs is exempted from IRB. However, if you have children in that mix, so think Running Start students, then you have to get consent. You always have to de-identify it. Even if it's an exempted project, your data should always be de-identified. So that's where it gets a little tricky because you go through IRB, you say, hey, this is exempt. It's part of my assessment of my program or assessment of my class. It's academic. It's what I do. So I shouldn't have to get that approved. But you're still responsible for the data. And that's where this data piece has become huge. I go to these conferences for research administration and there's like a whole track just on data and how we do that. So it gets really sticky. So I don't want to keep you past the time, so I apologize.
Thank you.
If anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to